So we're inundated all the time with this idea of what is leadership and what kind of leadership do we need for the type of challenges we're facing. And a lot of the time what we're indulging in is a wee bit of a fantasy. Now, as you can probably hear from my accent already, I'm not from Australia originally, I'm originally from Scotland. And in a former life in Scotland, I worked in the drug and alcohol area. And I worked with an organisation which put young people who were involved in drug and alcohol at the heart of the issue, to really empower them around what do solutions look like, but to tap into the wisdom that they brought about actually how do we address this. And that thread, if you like, and that theme has been pretty core to the work that I do. I came out to Australia and worked with an organisation, Streetwise, which many of you may well be aware of. Good, some nods. It's not around anymore, unfortunately, but I had a great 5 years working, but particularly because the principle of Streetwise and the work that I was doing before is a belief that communities and people have got the wisdom to solve their own problems. The difficulty is we look to other people who are in more of authority roles to solve them. So I'm going to be working with, particularly given the nature of CDAT, and taking that thread into the leadership work I've been doing over the last decade, has been looking at how do we bring together people like yourselves who are passionate and committed about trying to make change, but actually understanding what is it we're trying to do together. And when we bring people together who don't normally work together, we're not wired for that, and we don't often set up our systems for that. So I may be kind of challenging a few of the myths, but I'm hoping that by the end of this there'll be something useful that you can take away and apply to the work that you do. So before I start to flick through these slides, who here wants change or believes that we need change? Most people in the room. Okay, great. Who here wants to change? Okay, we've got a few. Good. Great. So this is the first kind of principle around leadership that's happening, is that, you know, we want change, we think it's great, but actually the type of adaptive change that I'm going to talk about means we've got to do something different if we want a different outcome. Who here considers themselves to be a leader or is looked to as a leader by people in their community or organisation? Show of hands, don't be shy. Yeah, a few. Okay, great. So you will be very aware of the type of scrutiny and pressure that is on that role, that we really can't go very far without hearing people look to you, the people who put their hand up in your roles, to fix things, to get things done. That we constantly hear this narrative all the time around, if only they would be able to, can they just fix it? You know, we're seeing Trump and Clinton on our screens daily, that rather depressing sight around, is this what leadership looks like? And if it is, what does that mean for us if we've actually got people like that who are running it? So if we're not leaving it up to them, who's it left to? And I think one of the challenges we find is that we get caught in this cycle of complaint. And it's a bit of a paradox, because you may be in a position where people are looking to you for leadership, but also we love to complain about it. We love this big whinge around how bad leadership is. And again, that speaks to this fantasy that there is anybody else out there but us who can actually solve our problems. So we get caught in this. I get caught into this myself, you know, over a few glasses of wine. It's really nice to have a good whinge about them all. But what am I doing about it? And what can I do? And what does leadership look like for me? So who here, put your hand up, can I see a show of hands about people who have got better outcomes for their family or their community or their organisation by being willing to challenge the norms of what's going on? Okay, so you've exercised leadership. Put your hand up if you have been able to shift the outcomes for your family, your community, your organisation by you changing your behaviour in some way. Great, so you've all exercised leadership as well. Put your hand up if you have sat in a meeting or in a gathering of people and watched people constantly avoid the key issue that nobody wants to talk about. Yeah, great, everyone's putting their hand up. And you've spoken out against it, that you've chosen to actually name what's going on, even though you know that that's going to not look good for you. Okay, so we've got far more leaders in the room when we start to think about leadership in a broad way around actually there's no such thing as a leader. What is useful to think about is there's people who we look to get things done and to help us guide a process. But if we think about leadership as an activity, that it's something we can all do, what you've all put your hands up around is when you've named things, you've helped people, your families, your communities, organizations face reality. So that's the definition of leadership that I'm going to be working with today, is that leadership is about how do we help people solve their own problems, tap into the wisdom that is already there and get things done. Not a kind of what I'd call counterfeit leadership, which is what we see playing out on our TV screens most days. So rent this idea. I'm not trying to sell you it, but I'm asking you to rent this idea that leadership is a muscle. It's something like when we go to the gym, we can build that muscle, and we don't need to be on as a leader all the time because that's exhausting. So first of all, thinking about, well, what does it look like then if every day we've got an opportunity to exercise leadership by coming back to what is the higher purpose of what we're trying to do? What are those high purpose outcomes we're trying to get in our communities, for people around us, for our families, but our organizations? That means we might have to surface some unresolved issues. We might have to ask the difficult questions, but we can all do it every day. But first of all, we've kind of got to understand what is it we're actually trying to address and what's the leadership challenge that we're facing. And often what happens when we're down in the weeds with it all, it's a bit hard to see the wood for the trees. So I like to use this analogy about a survival guide in leadership is to get on the balcony so you can actually see what's going on. Now, this analogy draws on the times when you had a balcony and you had a dance floor. But if you stay with this kind of analogy for a wee while, that if you get on the balcony, you can see who's in the room, who's dancing with who. What are you dancing to? Do people like the music that's being played? Who's not dancing? Who's sitting down? Who's not even in the room? And who are the bouncers on the door that are stopping other people coming in to the dance that you're trying to do together? Now, working collaboratively can be a bit like that. You're still with me on this dance metaphor. But when we're in it and we're on the dance floor, it's a wee bit hard to see what's going on because all I can see are the people around me. They might be standing on my toes, they might be banging into me, which often happens when we're trying to collaborate. But I can't really see what's going on. I can only see what's in front. So this practice of being able to step out and scan the horizon and see what's going on is a survival guide in leadership. If you look at the downfall of some of it, prime ministers, people in these positions, CEOs, it can be really hard to have that breadth. And often where they've been caught is when they haven't been able to see what's actually going on, what's happening in community, what's happening at grassroots level. And this is where the role of CDATs plays a really key role in being able to feed that dynamic and the information about what's going on. But we've also got to be able to step out of it and see what's happening beyond our own part of it. So today we're on the balcony. I'm literally on the balcony, but I'm going to invite you to be on the balcony through this process to think about what is the challenge that you are trying to address. So we hear a lot about complex problems and trying to address complex problems. So I just want to first of all go through what do we mean when we're saying a complex problem. And I like to think of it a bit like spaghetti. So your focus is on drug and alcohol issues in your community. Now, you pull one strand of spaghetti, and when you're looking at the drug issues, and it's so interlinked and tied up with other things. So we've already heard this morning about mental health being linked to it around, then we look at employment, education, connection. What are the issues that are going on in our community, of which drug and alcohol may be a symptom of that? But that's really overwhelming. We end up trying to kind of deal with the whole elephant rather than nibble on the trunk of it. That's another analogy I'm putting in. But we can make the complex simple. So if you think about the key issues that you're grappling with in your community, it's one where we'll see you'll bring a whole load of different people to the table, but we'll never have enough knowledge or information. And actually, the knowledge and information we have will be contradictory depending on who we speak to and what part of community they represent. They're going to have a different view. And everybody's right, because from your perspective and your sector, that's exactly the issue that you're focusing on. But there's a lot of different people involved, and everybody's got a different opinion. Usually we'll see when we look at, let's add up how much this issue is costing us, there'll be millions of dollars attributed to all the different programs and services which are being thrown at an issue. And they're all interconnected. We can't actually separate them out. You know, we'll start talking about looking at drug treatment, drug issues, we'll look at education. They'll all start to meld together. And the difficulty here is that we approach it as if there was one way of addressing it. So, who here thinks they're dealing with a complex problem? Yeah? Great. Okay, good. So I can keep on going with this. So pretty much thinking about how do we make the complex simple. So I'm going to try and break that down now, and this is just a wee graph which can work for some people, not for others. But what we see on the far end here is there will be different challenges we're facing where pretty much people know what to do about it and how to address it, that you've already got the expertise or the skills to address it, or you can buy them in. And then on the other side is the level of agreement about what a solution looks like. So, I'll go the right way. The first kind of example of this is a simple challenge that you might face where, you know, and I use the analogy of baking a cake. There's a recipe for it. So there might be challenges you're facing in your community where you know what to do. There's a lot of agreement about how to do it. You're not kind of going to argue too much about what should be in the recipe. And usually we're following best practice guidelines. So a lot of the service delivery land is in this space where you're drawing on what we already know, but it's a simple problem. It doesn't need anything more complicated. And then we think about the idea of how you put a woman on the moon. Yes, it's a wee bit more complicated. Yeah, it might happen. A bit more complicated. So we've got the technology now. We know how to do that. But it might mean that we've got to bring different ideas together, different skills, different ways of doing it. We've got to get some experts in to do it. And what we see there is we know how to do it, and pretty much people agree on, yeah, this is the right approach. And then we come to other issues which are a bit more political in nature. So thinking about needle syringe programs or the injection room in King's Cross, which John talked about earlier. So that's an example of maybe a political challenge where there's a lot of best practice sitting behind it and a lot of good evidence to show that we need to do this, that it works. So we know what to do when we're running these centres, but we can't get agreement. People don't want to have them in their own backyard. So the response to that and what we need to do is actually be able to develop some kind of common ground and find compromise. The challenge isn't that we don't know how to do it. It's that we've got to get lots of different people working together. And people have to give something up. People don't want it in their neighbourhood, whatever it looks like. So that's more of a political challenge. And then in the far corner, we've got more chaotic challenges where, and it might feel like a lot of the work that you do is in this space. But generally speaking, when we've got chaos or we've got some kind of disaster, the response to that is we can't figure out how do we address it. We've got to get stability straight away so that people can actually be safe enough and calm enough to focus on the work. And then it might be that afterwards, in our reflection on what we did to address it, we find some opportunities to innovate. But in the moment, we've just got to get it done. Then we've got in the middle wicked, adaptive, complex problems, which is where this is about how do we actually shift whole regions, towns, areas that we want to have cities where we're trying to get to the fundamental root cause of an issue. And the response to that is we don't have a best practice recipe for it. We have lots of experts and people who've got an idea and an opinion, but actually the work is on how we work together. So our response there is far more about building an emergent practice, about how do we learn into what the issue is, because depending on where you sit, you're going to have a very different idea about what the problem should be. So we've got to learn by doing. We've got to build ways of working which allow us to try things, experiment, fail, get things wrong. That's really different to how we set up our services. Most of the time, we set up our services to deal with either simple or complicated problems, sometimes political ones, sometimes chaotic. But we're not designing our services to try and get system change, to try things and fail. It can be career limiting. We can lose our funding if we do too many things wrong and we're not getting there. So we've got to tackle complex problems in a different way. So I just want to check in on some of the warning signs that there might be a case for change on this, on doing things differently, and some of these may be familiar to you. So if you're seeing that as you're trying to work together in your CDATs or in the areas you're focusing on, we see a number of silos coming up. And that's where, we'll have duplication of services and resources. And it could be that the service users, the people you're trying to reach, face huge gaps in how they can actually access services. Often it can be exacerbating the issue. There could be that there's outdated policies and that the policies that are in place may contribute or impose barriers for service users in some way, or when you're trying to actually tackle the complex problems. And where we see that there's very little innovation going on, that even when we see new ideas coming up, they're not really addressing the true nature of the problem. They're kind of tinkering around at the edges. And it would be an environment where it's really hard to take risks. So we can't get innovation and new thinking unless we can take risks. And also do that by bringing diversity to the table, which is why I started off with that. Because often we seek out people who see the world the way we do. And it's only by me working with people who have a completely different idea of the world that I'm going to learn. It might challenge me, I might find it really difficult, but that's really where the gold lies in collaboration. When we can bring together people who have very different views of the issue and find a way to work together. And inequity is one of the other things we might see playing out. And what that means is that we're actually seeing that there's very few people with lived experience involved in the process, that the end users, the people who you're actually doing the work for, are often not visible or present within the work. And that, there's different impacts on different parts of community, that people who are more marginalized are not being engaged in the solution to it. And also, that comes down to, limited power sharing, that we can't really have equality in our solutions unless we can share power and bring people in who usually have less power on this issue. And also looking at where there might be that the initiatives that are being invested in, where there's a lack of scale, that they really are only reaching a very specific target population. And you might be getting outcomes for a very small group of people, but there's not really the resources or the capacity to expand that. So in terms of kind of case for change, who's seeing some of these different dynamics playing out? Again, if I can just get a show of hands. Yep, a number of people. Great. Okay, well, this could be a good time to, Norman, I need to do the Slido question, so we're going to see if the technology is working. So if you could list one complex problem that is currently being faced in your CDAT, given the definition, if you can put that into your phone.
Lack of services.
Thanks. Are these all coming through now? That's really quick. Great. It's working. Okay, so difficulty getting into high school, education. Community doesn't acknowledge drugs and alcohol being consumed. So when we have kind of denial around that, how do we draw attention, help people face reality? Okay, get new members, long-term commitment, engagement. So there's a few, there are things like social injustice, alcohol, education. We're seeing where these are all linked, that we can unpack these. And in the workshop afterwards, I'm going to work with this more deeply on actually what can you do, how can you start to make sense of it. So if you keep those coming through. So how do you respond to the needs of diverse groups? Probably, even though people are putting them in for their own region, is this all really familiar? Yeah? Okay, so we'll keep those coming up as I go through, and I'll come back to these. So I want to pose then, what do we do about this? So it's all very well, again, to join the kind of complaint around the leaderships there, but to think about this in a different way. So I'm going to talk to you about an approach about how you get collective impact as opposed to potentially just isolated impact. And I'm saying this with a bit of a caveat that not all communities are ready to do that, are ready to engage in that process. But wherever you are and whatever stage you're at in your community, there might be some elements of this which might be useful if you're trying to get collaboration, engaging business, engaging community, service providers. But first of all, thinking about, as I've said, leadership being an activity, that we're trying to get people to face reality and ultimately getting used to tackling complexity, uncertainty. Now, in that landscape, we have the opportunity then to bring people together who are all committed to a single agenda. And collective impact is really that. It's the difference from isolated impact, where you might be working on programs which are getting fantastic outcomes for a small group. The opportunity is, how do you link what you're doing with a small group of people and combine that with others to get a collective impact for your whole region, your town, wherever it is that you're working. In collective impact, there's 5 kind of core elements around that. And again, I'll be going into this in more detail in the workshop. But first of all, having that common agenda, which is the kind of population level change you're trying to go for. And usually we won't change a system unless we're looking at either a 10% increase or 10% decrease in the figures. So if the people who've identified unemployment as an issue, might be that you go for a common agenda about, okay, we're going to increase employment in our town by no less than 10%. If it's any less than that, it's really not changing the system. But the work is how you bring people together to define what is that issue that we all care about, that higher vision. And to give you an idea, some of the work that we're involved in different parts of Australia have different things, like a collective impact vision in Burnie in Tasmania, which is a 2025 vision. So this is long term. It's the next 10, 15 years to really start to shift the indicators. But their common agenda is around all young people will leave school and go into a meaningful, fulfilling job. So there's jobs in Burnie, but very few of them meaningful, fulfilling, and well paid, and that they're fit for purpose, and young people are trained and skilled into those. And they've got a whole range of other initiatives around that. The driver for that came from a lot of the drug issues which were happening in Burnie, as well as unemployment. But when you look at what they're doing, they're not really even talking about drug and alcohol in there, but it's in there because they're looking at the much broader work that has to go on. And then mutually reinforcing activities. So what that means is that whatever sector you represent, you're aligning what you're doing to the work that's going on in other places. So if you're in police, employment, in community, in neighbourhood centres, the question is, what is it that you are doing which can align and have a greater impact by aligning what you're doing with other people? It helps cut down on duplication, but also having a way to measure what does success look like then when you're in a process that might take 10 years. And that the indicators might be that you've just managed to get a group of people to stay at the table who've never talked to each other before. But there's a willingness because they're all committed to that shared purpose. And being able to communicate both not just what's working well, but counterintuitively where the failures are. What have you tried that didn't work? Great. What did you learn from that? And having a way of working which enables you to feed that in. The key to this is having a backbone organisation, which is an entity who's seen as neutral, i.e. you're not competing for funding, who can play that coordinating role. Now, collective impact came out of work that was done that they found that in all the cities and towns where people had got long-term outcomes, one of the key things was they had somebody or an entity coordinating. Without that, most collaborations fall over. So the CDATs are really well positioned to think about that role of being able to coordinate activities, engage, but being able to work across multiple different stakeholders and different levels of power. What we're talking about here is fundamentally designing your work to get system change as opposed to programmatic change. And that's a different way of working. It's a different way you would structure that. But building, what we're doing is tapping into actually what's already going on in community, building on the strengths of that, but aligning that to go, what can we do collectively that we can't do by ourselves? But fundamentally, we're talking about that being coming from the grass tops, if you like, rather than the grassroots, building that layer of engaged people like yourselves who know what's going on in community. It's not about another program. It's actually very often not about more funding. but it's about looking at how do we use the resources and the money that is already in this community differently by collaborating. Thank you. I'll end there and open to questions. Thank you.